Hello there, my name's Card. I'm a professional historical researcher, as well as a long-time progressive community organizer and activist. And here on my YouTube page, I like to make simple little videos talking about topics I'm interested in. Today, I just want to talk for a little bit about an aspect of reactionary cultural movements that I unfortunately don't think we've seen any big YouTube lefties touch on all that much before. Of course, there's definitely a wealth of great and publicly accessible analysis of why hard right-wing social movements are the way they are on this platform alone. But oddly enough, what I can't recall ever having seen any particular coverage of is what we might term the intentional forgettability of moral panics. And I just wanted to lay down some basic concepts you, the viewer, can take away to think about, that I suspect you might have intuited on some level, but might very well not ever have had spelled out to you in a way you could re-articulate to someone else if you had to explain the concept. So that's what I want to provide as quickly as possible. The general thing I want to drive at here is how, as you probably already know if you're a dyed-in-the-wool progressive, but as hard right-wing political projects the world over push their conservative economic and legislative agendas, parallel to all that is a reactionary culture which shapes and is shaped by conservative political policy. And that culture commonly metastasizes as one moral panic after another. At the moment, reactionary culture looks like being broadly anti-trans people, anti-DEI program, anti-abortion access, and just generally anti-woke, whatever they think that means. We all know the what topics the right is most vocally mad about changes every few years or so. Everyone watching this will surely remember that in recent memory their focus was more on being anti-vaccines, anti-face masks, anti-gay marriage, anti-Muslim, so on. But if you go back far enough, you can expand that list to being anti-violent video games, anti-rock music, anti-Dungeons and Dragons, anti-psychiatry, anti-women in the workplace, anti-comic books, anti-movies, anti-desegregation, anti-Italian, anti-Greek, anti-Irish, anti-Jewish, anti-Catholic, anti-Freemason, anti-witchcraft, etc., etc. Moral panics have been around a long, long time. And of course, for one thing, they're typically, ostensibly, about an element of some new societal phenomenon that isn't actually real. Like movies and video games and D&D are real, but they're not really corrupting the youth. Italian migrants, or the Jews, or the Freemasons aren't really scheming in some secret cabal somewhere planning to take over your country. And witches just aren't real at all. Witchcraft isn't real, that's simply not a thing. It didn't stop an awful lot of people getting scared and angry about it, though. Now, plenty of people have pointed out before that, for one thing, all these moral panics could be thought of as the material way in which other, unspoken reactionary prejudices are expressed. For example, the right knows that games and movies aren't going to expose teenagers to Satanism or whatever. They just don't like the idea of minors expressing any sort of countercultural interests. They know there isn't really any scheming, foreigner, Jewish, Masonic cabal, they're just racist. The Puritans knew that witches weren't real. No one had ever really been the victim of a witchcraft attack. They just had a socio-religious interest in curbing the autonomy of 17th century women a little bit more than it already had been. That's all good basic leftist analysis of why moral panics happen. But I wanted to hone in on how and why, as soon as the dedicated reactionary right loses public support at large for their side of a moral panic, why it is so soon forgotten. For instance, look at gay marriage in the US or the West more broadly. Grassroots support for the legalization of gay marriage had been around as an absolute minority position for over 100 years, but it started picking up proper steam as a real salient political issue in the West in the 1990s. The political right fought back real hard on the issue for 20, 25, 30 years before public support had swung hard enough that, long story short, gay marriage started getting legalized all over most of the developed world. In that time, conservatives really had fought tooth and nail to win both legislative victories that would keep gay marriage down as long as possible, as well as attempting to keep a hold of hearts and minds as long as they could. But once the dams burst and it started becoming legal, they retreated surprisingly quickly, and most conservative lawmakers just conceded and called it a settled issue. The same goes for a lot of social issues that have come and gone, including the big ones like desegregation and universal suffrage, as well as more ticky-tacky minor stuff like the 80s and 90s culture war battles over D&D and violent arcade games. But regardless, no matter what the issue is, the right fights like hell to resist it. That's essentially what turns these issues into moral panics in the first place, the massive tantrum reactionaries throw about the issues of the day. But what always happens is that every single moral panic turns out to be little more than a cultural holding action, and the issue at hand is immediately retreated away from once the forces of conservatism inevitably fail to hold on to public opinion forever. And crucially, this doesn't happen because any of the reactionaries driving this stuff are good people at heart who end up seeing the error of their ways, of course. Quite the opposite, in fact. It's completely self-interested. Downplaying the last moral panic is part of the right's playbook for doing the next moral panic. If you can pretend you weren't just defeated and wrong about the last cultural issue, it means you don't have to concede you're not going to be all that credible about the next thing. And for the individual right-wing cultural commentator and the people who lead these moral panics, especially in cases where we're talking about major civil rights issues, you don't have to admit to you and yourself and others that you've been part of a political hate mob targeting mostly powerless groups. In either case, the final stage of any given failing reactionary movement is to deny its own existence and try and forget it ever happened. Which means the final stage of fighting any given failing reactionary movement is to refuse to forget it ever happened. Don't ever fail to acknowledge that virtually every moral panic is caused by the reactionary right, and they're in the wrong about it every time. Point out that every moral panic is a retread of the last one, and whether it's over cultural issues, feminism, LGBT rights, these moral panics turn out to be nonsense, and nothing bad ever happens because of social progress. And when right-wingers try to deny these moral panics didn't happen, it's bullshit. And no one, absolutely no one, trying to do this performative amnesia about moral panics that are still well within living memory is doing it in good faith. Anytime you hear someone try to downplay the feminist movement or the gay rights movement by suggesting it was overblown or that actually the right has always supported the modern position XYZ, they're lying. It's simple as that. Right now, despite the fact that gay marriage only became a settled issue in the West about a decade ago, conservatives are already trying to play pretend that it's the left who are the real homophobes or whatever, because something individual liberties or some made-up retcon nonsense. When the BLM movement comes up over there in the US, is the line from GOP Republicans not the left are the real racists? I guarantee 20, 30 years from now, we're legitimately going to start hearing stuff like Democrats are the real transphobes, or denial that QAnon was ever a thing once the last of the baby boomers die off. Some 10-odd years later, reactionaries on the internet still want to retread the Gamergate harassment campaign as if we didn't have a digital record of the last decade. They might even manage to convince some people that it was really about ethics and games journalism or something laughable like that. But once you've been around for a while, so long as you're paying attention, you start to notice this sort of stuff happening in real time. But, like noticing any sort of cultural pattern or any topic in political discourse, knowing all this only really matters in so much as you have some way of meaningfully applying it to your outlook on life and your approach to political organising. And to that end, again, I just want to emphasise that you mustn't play along with the right's amnesia for these sorts of things. Because a large part of perpetuating the next moral panic, and the next after that, is forgetting all the ones that have come before. That's just about all I have to say today. I hope you got something to think about out of all of that. Once again, my name's Card. If you might like to hear more from me, feel free to subscribe to this YouTube page, or just take a look at my other videos. Either way, goodbye for now, and have a lovely day.